Je suis désolé que les affiches ne sont pas en français, mais je vais le faire en anglais. My name is Stephan Reichhold, as mentioned, and I work with the Immigrant Services Association of Nova Scotia, and I'm happy to be here today. And I'm grateful for the Chief Laflamme to have welcomed me to this territory and welcomed us to this territory. I come from the Mi'kmaq territory, the traditional unceded territory that makes up what you probably know of as Nova Scotia and the Maritimes, and parts of Maine as well. I'm going to be focusing today on some of the work that we do at ISANS, and in particular, the work that we've worked with intercultural communities. We have done some work and reconciliation work, which I'm not really going to talk about today, but just to say that we have done a lot of reconciliation work as well at ISANS with our First Nations partners. So I'm going to focus in particular on our relationship between newcomers and working with the African Nova Scotian community. And when I say the African Nova Scotian community, for those of you who aren't from the Maritimes, this is a community that isn't part of what we'd think of from the African diaspora that has recently come from the continent, but it is the indigenous 400 years plus community of people who live in Nova Scotia who have their ancestry from Africa. So many of those who work in settlement are familiar with and recognize that surges, like we saw with the Syrians, when the Syrians arrived, and the surges that come with newcomers presents opportunities, but it also presents challenges. So the community that you see here is north end of Halifax, and like many cities, Halifax has very few affordable housing options. And newcomers receive inadequate and insufficient resources, as many of us know. And as a result, many of them struggle to access housing and find themselves in low-income or public housing areas. And this is a public housing complex known in the north end of Halifax as Uniacke Square. These are well-established communities that have their own histories, stories, challenges, and circumstances. In the case of Uniacke Square, many of the residents trace their history to Africville. Africville was a community located on the shores of the Bedford Basin in Halifax. It was a vibrant, close-knit, primarily African Nova Scotian community. It was this case until the residents were forcibly relocated in the 1960s, and their homes, church, communities were destroyed to make way for the development of the McKay Bridge, which is a bridge that crosses from Halifax to Dartmouth. And it represented another in a long line of egregious acts of racism that have been directed against the African Nova Scotian community. So many of the current residents of Uniacke Square are descendants of Africville, a community that still has not been properly acknowledged or compensated for their loss. Despite the racism, poverty, and marginalization, residents have strived to develop and prosper. And it's in this community, in particular, in this neighborhood, where some of the waves of newcomers, in this particular case, the recent case of Syrians, have descended. So we have a community where neither the African Nova Scotian community, long-term residents, nor the Syrian newcomers had much choice about where they got to live. And they've come together in this community and live in this community, and actually, through that process, have encountered some challenges and conflict and tensions between these groups. So some of the challenges and conflicts that have emerged and tensions that have emerged have taken place in schools, recreation centers, public spaces, community gardens, parks, that sort of thing. This particular picture shows a part of Uniacke Square where there's a park between the housing complex and a recreation center. And in this space, we had a community, the African Nova Scotian community primarily, but residents of Uniacke Square over time rehabilitated a dilapidated park. So it was a park that had many challenges associated with it, but the community came together and developed that park and made it into a beautiful space for families and community members. And it's also a space that the Syrian newcomers, when they first arrived, also began to use. And the young boys and the men in particular would come out and play football, soccer in that space. That's how it was originally kind of used and in the community. What ended up happening that we noticed over time was that the Syrians began to retreat out of that space and no longer be present in that area, in that physical public space. And the African Nova Scotian community, in particular African Nova Scotian youth, began to occupy that space. More and more of them would come, particularly over this past summer. That was an indication that there were tensions, a clear indication there was something going on between these communities. And when we look at conflicts, we all know that conflicts, there are things that are underneath the conflict, things that are holding it up, pillars that maintain conflicts between communities. And in particular, when we used some analysis and began to think about what are those pillars that are maintaining this conflict, we look at things like attitudes, behaviors, and context. And so for the Syrians, you had, in terms of their attitudes, they had a fear of a new place, they're not knowing how to fit in, and a belief that they received from all sorts of places like social media and from interactions, a belief that African Nova Scotians are dangerous somehow. On the other side, the African Nova Scotians' attitudes looked in particular at, they had a loss of community space. They felt that there was newcomers who were getting advantages that they were not getting. So what we often see is when marginalized communities see others getting particular things that they may not be able to access, that causes some dissonance for them and some challenges for them. And that's what we were seeing. There was a distrust about the religion as well. African Nova Scotians uncertain as to who these people who were coming in, who primarily had Muslim identities, who were they and what did that mean? In particular, for their context, African Nova Scotians have a strong history in the Christian community. And there were in this scenario between these communities, you had the fear that the newcomers were here to harm us. That was some of the attitudes that were in place for some of the African Nova Scotians. And so that's the attitudes. And the behaviors that we saw between these two communities were essentially the ostracizing, where the Syrians were removing themselves. There was insults, there was fights, threats, and escalation of violence involving the police as well. The African Nova Scotians began to occupy space, taking space back in their language and in their understanding, and also the same thing in terms of fighting. Thinking about the context, because that's an important element for both sides as to why that conflict is maintained, why those tensions are still in place. For the Syrians, they're coming out of a war zone. They don't know the history of the long-term residents in the area. They're unfamiliar with the context, the culture, the communities, and they've learned how to be resilient and how to protect their own. In terms of the African Nova Scotian community, you have historical racism, poverty and marginalization, and a perceived loss of space, now to a new group. This Syrians, for African Nova Scotians, just represent the newest and latest wave of newcomers to come, but not the only one. So this is an experience they've had in the past, another new group coming into our space. And they're a resilient community and not willing to back down. So that's the context of what's going on between these communities. And we know when we think about conflict that's happening and you think about an iceberg with what you see at the top and most of what's down below, and the beginning of a conflict, there's a process whereby the formation of the conflict happens. In this case, it was when the newcomers arrived, and then there's an intensification as they start to settle and what that means, and there starts to be more and more interactions between them, and then an escalation. And you have a whole lot of people who underneath, who may not be experiencing some of those conflicts, may not be in the streets fighting on this, but may have similar understandings and hold similar attitudes and beliefs. And when we think about what conflict happens, and we're thinking about, well, how do you manage conflict? What do you do with that? And think about the different stages of conflict management. You have a prevention stage, an intervention, and hopefully at some point maybe you'll have a mediation stage, and if things work out, a transformation stage. So it's thinking about where are we in this conflict, and therefore what do we need to do about it? Clearly we were past a prevention. In some cases we were looking at some preventative measures, but we were also looking a bit beyond that. So the analysis is really important when you think about what's happening and having an understanding of what's going on, who's involved, who are the players, what do we need to know, thinking about the attitudes, the behaviors, and the context. And from that, we then developed a community development and conflict transformation strategy that we're still currently in. So when I say that, what we did was we, as a settlement organization, had people from the community coming to us and saying there's tensions, there's fights, there's things going on. You as a settlement organization who works with the Syrians need to respond in some way. And so as a settlement agency, and as you can see up here, I'm a white individual whose first language is English. And so in my role at iSense, I'm thinking, okay, what do I need to do about that? What role can I play? So I'm looking for champions and allies and role models and thinking about who else in the community do we need to engage with and work with, and specifically who. Not just generally who, but very specifically, who do I need to work with and how do we need to do that? And so it's about relationship building. So we brought together organizations which would have represented folks from the African Nova Scotian community and organizations like settlement agencies that represent folks from the newcomer community to come together to start some of that relationship building. And in fact, those groups also had to go through processes of meeting each other and understanding each other and sharing their context. Thank you. And naming the issue. It's okay, I'm good. And had to name the issues and think about the mediation and processes that we might need to take place, and then hopefully leading to success and communicating the results to a wider community. So some of the things that happened out of that was one of the recreation centers recognized that they maybe needed to bring a Syrian onto staff, and the Halifax Regional Municipality and iSANS came together to bring about some peer mediation, because we realized that some of the conflicts that were happening with the youth, we couldn't necessarily work with the direct youth who might be involved in the conflict, but we could work with some of the other youth who maybe have influence in the community. And that's what we did. So we brought these youth together for an opportunity to really have a chance to share and also learn some mediative skills. And one of the big parts of what bringing them together was really about them having an opportunity to see each other, and sometimes for the first time. So they did things like they shared information around food that they liked or they didn't like, and they asked each other questions. And we had them, for instance, in small groups in their own communities and their own identities and say, as Syrians, what do you want to know about the African Nova Scotians?